Founding Fathers, Vision, Conflict, and Creation. This narrative centers on the generation we call the Founding Fathers, the political leaders, thinkers, activists, soldiers, and organizers who led the 13 British North American colonies from imperial subjects into independent states, and who crafted the constitutional settlement that created the United States of America. Vision, Conflict, and Creation captures three intertwined dynamics: the ideals and intellectual inheritance that shaped their vision, the conflicts, political, military, social, and moral, that propelled dramatic change, and the creation of institutions, state governments, a national constitution, political practices, intended to embody both principle and compromise. The story is not a hagiography. The founders were brilliant and flawed, visionary and self-interested, emancipatory and deeply conservative about many social hierarchies. To understand early America, we must trace ideas and institutions, alongside struggles over power, property, and human dignity. Roots, ideas, settlements, and early colonial life. Before America became a nation, before there was even the dream of independence, there were ideas. Ideas carried across the Atlantic in the hearts and minds of colonists, reformers, and adventurers. To understand the Founding Fathers, their debates, their documents, their vision, we have to step back into those early centuries when Europe's intellectual traditions took root in the soil of a new world. The men who would later lead the American Revolution were not inventing liberty from nothing. They were inheritors of a long struggle, a centuries-old contest between authority and rights, between the crown and the governed. From the Magna Carta of 1215, English nobles had forced their king to accept the idea that power could be limited, that even a monarch must obey the law. That ancient document, written in Latin on parchment, would echo through history as the first great check on arbitrary rule. Over time, these principles deepened. By the 1600s, England had endured civil war, regicide, and finally, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Kings were overthrown, parliaments rose. The idea took hold that sovereignty did not belong to a single ruler, but to the people's representatives. Out of these upheavals came a political expectation that free Englishmen were entitled to certain rights, to be taxed only with their consent, to be tried by a jury, to speak without fear of royal reprisal. These were the seeds of liberty, planted in the minds of colonists long before the word revolution was ever spoken. But there was more than English precedent at work. Across Europe, a new age was dawning, the Enlightenment, and its thinkers offered a moral vocabulary for political change. The philosopher John Locke wrote that all humans are born with natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that governments exist only by the consent of the governed. If rulers violated that trust, citizens had not only the right, but the duty to resist. These ideas traveled like wildfire across the Atlantic, printed in pamphlets, debated in taverns, and preached from colonial pulpits. In Locke's words, Americans found moral justification for rebellion, a belief that freedom was not a gift from a monarch, but a birthright of all men. And still another influence reached back even farther, to the classical world. The founders devoured the writings of ancient Rome and Greece. They admired the Roman Republic, with its checks on power and civic virtue, and feared the corruption that had led to its fall. They studied Cicero and Polybius, who warned that republics die when citizens put self-interest above the common good. From Renaissance thinkers like Machiavelli and Montesquieu, they learned that liberty survives only when power is divided, when ambition is made to counteract ambition. So by the mid-1700s, the intellectual toolkit of an American patriot was already full. From England, the tradition of limited monarchy and common law; from the Enlightenment, the creed of natural rights; and from the ancients, the vision of civic virtue and balanced government. These would soon collide, with empire, with economics, and with each other. By the middle of the 18th century, Britain's North American colonies had matured into a sprawling mosaic of societies, diverse in people, economy, and spirit. In New England, rocky soil and harsh winters limited large-scale farming. Here, small family farms, coastal trade, and shipbuilding dominated. Villages gathered around their churches and schools. Town meetings gave ordinary citizens a direct voice in local affairs. This was the birthplace of a civic culture, deeply moral, community-minded, and suspicious of distant authority. Further south, in the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, diversity was the hallmark. German farmers, Dutch traders, English merchants, and Quakers lived side by side. The soil was rich and the rivers wide. Wheat, corn, and trade goods flowed toward bustling ports like Philadelphia and New York City. Religious tolerance and ethnic variety fostered a pragmatic commercial society, one that valued order, prosperity, and coexistence over ideology. But in the southern colonies, a different world prevailed. There, vast plantations stretched across Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. The economy revolved around tobacco, rice, and indigo, crops that required intensive labor. Labor provided, brutally, by enslaved Africans and their descendants. By the 1750s, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children were enslaved in the southern colonies. The wealth of planters rested on their bondage, even as those same planters spoke eloquently of liberty and the rights of man. So across 13 colonies, there were three broad worlds: one small-scale and communal, one commercial and pluralistic, and one aristocratic, hierarchical, and dependent on slavery. And yet, despite their differences, all shared certain assumptions: a belief in English legal rights, Protestant moral values, and private property as the foundation of independence. Even the most radical thinkers among them could scarcely imagine a world without hierarchy, at least not yet. These regional contrasts would shape everything that followed: how colonists viewed authority, how they defined freedom, and eventually how they fought each other in both Revolution and Civil War. But in the 18th century, they were bound together by commerce, language, and a shared loyalty to Britain, a loyalty soon to be tested. The early colonies were laboratories of governance. From the very beginning, settlers experimented with the balance between local autonomy and imperial oversight. Most colonies had elected assemblies, small parliaments of property-owning men, who controlled taxation, militia funding, and local laws. Above them stood the royal governors, appointed by the crown, who held veto power and represented imperial interests. In theory, it was a system of cooperation. In practice, it was a constant negotiation, and often a struggle, over who truly governed. In New England, the town meeting became a symbol of self-rule. Citizens gathered in wooden meeting houses to vote on taxes, roads, and schools. Participation was limited. Women, servants, and most non-property holders were excluded. But the habit of local debate and collective decision-making took deep root. These communities were learning, without quite knowing it, the rhythms of democracy. In the middle and southern colonies, assemblies like the Virginia House of Burgesses or Pennsylvania's General Assembly played similar roles. They controlled local budgets, passed laws, and sometimes openly defied the royal governors. By the 1760s, many colonists had spent generations electing their own representatives, negotiating with and resisting imperial directives. When Parliament later tried to tax or regulate them without consent, Americans would not see it as reform but as betrayal. These institutions taught colonists something profound: that liberty was not an abstract philosophy, but a lived practice, exercised in town halls, courtrooms, and assemblies. By governing themselves, they had developed a political identity distinct from Britain's, one grounded in participation, debate, and a sense that government derived its legitimacy from the people. That expectation that government must listen to its citizens became the cornerstone of American political culture. When imperial policy later began to shift, when Britain sought to tighten control, those expectations would ignite into resistance. So by the mid-18th century, the American colonies stood on the edge of transformation. They were diverse, yet connected, loyal, yet increasingly confident in their own capacity for self-government. They carried the intellectual heritage of England and Europe, the rights of man, the rule of law, the civic virtues of republicanism, and had adapted them to a new environment. Their minds were trained by pamphlets and sermons, their hands by the work of building towns and legislatures from the ground up. When crisis came, they would reach instinctively for these traditions, to argue, to rebel, and ultimately to create a nation. But all of that still lay ahead. In the colonies of early America, the roots were already spreading, the roots of vision, of conflict, and of creation. The road to revolution, conflict, and constitutional crisis. In the aftermath of Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War, the empire stood triumphant, yet deeply indebted. The British government looked to its colonies to help shoulder the financial burden of imperial defense. London sought to reform its relationship with the colonies, not out of malice, but from a conviction that the empire must be more centralized, efficient, and profitable. What began as fiscal reform quickly became a constitutional crisis. New taxes and trade regulations swept through the colonies: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1767, and eventually the Tea Act of 1773. At the same time, Britain tried to restrict westward expansion with the Proclamation Line of 1763, forbidding settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains. For many colonists, these measures struck at their prosperity, mobility, and sense of self-government. Taxation without representation became the rallying cry, but the conflict ran deeper than taxes. It was a question of sovereignty. Who had the right to legislate for the colonies? Were Americans simply subjects of Parliament, or did they retain the traditional rights of Englishmen, including control over their own local taxation and governance? These questions stirred profound anxiety and anger across the Atlantic world. The colonies had long governed themselves in practice. Local assemblies, elected by property-holding men, handled taxation, militia defense, and internal laws. Royal governors often found themselves outmatched by the practical authority of colonial legislatures. When imperial officials began to assert Parliament's supremacy in all cases whatsoever, colonists perceived not just inconvenience, but tyranny. The debate soon took on a moral and philosophical tone. The language of commerce gave way to the language of rights. Political writers such as John Locke supplied the intellectual backbone for a new generation of American thinkers. Newspapers, pamphlets, and sermons spread revolutionary ideas through taverns, churches, and meeting halls. Ordinary farmers, merchants, and artisans began to discuss natural rights, the rule of law, and consent of the governed. In Massachusetts, men like Samuel Adams and James Otis stirred Boston's restless spirit, declaring that liberty was not a favor granted by Parliament, but an inborn right. Patrick Henry in Virginia thundered against British taxation in the House of Burgesses, proclaiming, "If this be treason, make the most of it." Across the colonies, dissent became organization. Committees of correspondence, boycotts, and mass meetings transformed protest into a networked resistance. Tension erupted into action. When Britain tried to rescue the failing East India Company by granting it a monopoly on tea, colonists saw a trap, a precedent that could extend control over all trade. In December 1773, disguised men boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped chests of tea into the water in defiance. The Boston Tea Party was more than a protest. It was a declaration that economic coercion would not be tolerated. The British government responded harshly with the Coercive or Intolerable Acts of 1774, closing Boston's port and revoking Massachusetts' charter. Instead of isolating radicals, these measures unified the colonies in outrage. Local leaders called for a continental response, and in September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, an unprecedented act of political cooperation. The Congress petitioned the king, sought to restore harmony, and organized boycotts. But reconciliation proved impossible. The empire saw sedition. The colonies saw oppression. When British troops marched on Lexington and Concord in April 1775 to seize colonial arms, shots were fired. The shot heard round the world. The war for independence had begun. By the time the Second Continental Congress convened, the colonies had crossed a point of no return. Makeshift armies surrounded Boston, militias clashed with regulars, and the dream of reconciliation faded. Out of the smoke of battle rose a vision of political rebirth. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, expressing in elegant prose the natural rights of man, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and asserting that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. This document did more than declare separation. It defined a new political identity. 13 fragile states, diverse and uncertain, now shared a common purpose: to defend liberty against empire and to prove that self-government could endure. The American Revolution was not only a war for independence, it was the beginning of an experiment in freedom that would reshape the modern world. As tension deepened, both sides misread the other. British ministers viewed colonial protests as the work of a few agitators. They believed firm action would restore obedience. But to the colonists, every new law, every new soldier, and every restriction on trade felt like a tightening chain. In the taverns of Boston, Philadelphia, and Williamsburg, debates raged. Farmers spoke of rights and representation. Merchants counted their losses from British blockades. Ministers preached about tyranny and divine justice. The spirit of liberty became not just a political cause, but a social awakening. Newspapers carried essays, signed with pseudonyms like Cato, Brutus, and a farmer. Their authors were schoolmasters, lawyers, merchants, men and women who wielded the printed word as a weapon. They warned of corruption, arbitrary power, and the decay of virtue that had undone republics of the past. The colonies were becoming not only politically aware, but philosophically alive. When royal troops marched through Boston's narrow streets, friction turned violent. The Boston Massacre of 1770, in which British soldiers fired into a crowd of protesting civilians, shocked the colonies. The deaths were few, but the symbolism immense. Blood had been spilled in defense of liberty. Paul Revere's engraving, circulated widely, transformed the event into propaganda for resistance. Even so, many colonists did not yet seek independence. Loyalty to the crown ran deep. Farmers in Pennsylvania, merchants in New York, and enslaved Africans in the South viewed rebellion with dread or uncertainty. For every revolutionary pamphlet, there were loyalist tracts urging patience and respect for British law. America in the 1770s was a land divided by fear, hope, and conviction. The British Empire, meanwhile, underestimated its opponents. Officials in London believed the colonies were too fractured, too dependent on British trade to unite in defiance. They imagined rebellion would collapse once faced with force, but each punitive measure only fueled the flame. Boycotts strengthened intercolonial ties. Smuggling and secret correspondence turned resistance into an underground network. When Parliament passed the Tea Act, even moderate colonists saw danger. The destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor was a symbolic line crossed. Property destroyed, authority defied. King George III declared the colonies in a state of open and avowed rebellion. British warships filled Boston Harbor. Redcoats marched through American streets. What had begun as protest over taxes had become a struggle for control of an empire. Across the colonies, militias drilled in open fields. Towns stored gunpowder, muskets, and provisions. Patriots formed committees of safety to replace royal authority. For the first time, ordinary citizens, artisans, farmers, blacksmiths, held political power in their hands. The colonies were improvising self-government in real time. Then came the fateful dawn of April 19th, 1775. British troops moved quietly toward Concord to seize colonial munitions. Riders like Paul Revere and William Dawes spread the alarm through the night. At Lexington Green, 70 colonial militiamen stood facing the British. No one knows who fired first, but when the smoke cleared, blood stained the grass. By day's end, British troops were harried all the way back to Boston by thousands of armed colonists. The American Revolution had begun not with a grand declaration, but with farmers defending their homes. The months that followed brought both chaos and resolve. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Delegates from every colony, from Virginia planters to New England radicals, debated how to fight and how to govern. They appointed George Washington commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, trusting his steadiness and honor to unite the effort. At the same time, they still sent the olive branch petition to King George, pleading for peace. It was rejected. Reconciliation was finished. As the war spread, the colonies faced immense challenges: lack of arms, untrained soldiers, and political division. Yet the struggle carried an ideal that inspired perseverance, that liberty and equality were worth sacrifice. Pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense electrified the public, stripping away illusions of royal authority. "'Tis time to part," Paine declared, and thousands agreed. By mid-1776, the dream of independence had moved from the fringes to the center of American life. The Continental Congress appointed a committee, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Sherman, and Livingston, to draft a declaration. In Jefferson's words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The power of those lines lay not in their novelty, but in their universality. They spoke to the human condition, not merely to the British colonies. When the Declaration of Independence was approved on July 4th, 1756, church bells rang and crowds gathered in town squares. Some wept, others cheered, and a few feared what would come next. For the first time, Americans called themselves not subjects, but citizens. The path ahead would be filled with hardship, defeat, hunger, uncertainty. But the idea had taken root. The people of 13 colonies had declared themselves free. Thus ended one era and began another, a world where liberty was no longer a gift from kings, but a right claimed by the governed. The revolution had begun in protest, matured in philosophy, and ignited in battle. What remained was to survive, and to build a republic that could live up to its ideals. War and the making of a republic. In the summer of 1776, as the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence, reality set in. The new United States of America faced the most powerful empire on earth. Its army was untrained, its treasury empty, and its people divided. Yet, at the heart of this fragile nation stood a figure who embodied both discipline and endurance: George Washington, commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Washington took command outside Boston in 1775. He found soldiers without uniforms, supplies, or experience. Yet he understood that this war would not be won by sheer force, but by perseverance, moral resolve, and the belief that liberty itself was at stake. "We must make the best of mankind as they are," he wrote, "since we cannot have them as we wish." The first test came swiftly. In August 1776, the British landed a massive invasion force on Long Island, more than 30,000 troops backed by the Royal Navy. Washington's inexperienced army was outflanked and nearly destroyed. Through courage and luck, he ordered a daring nighttime retreat across the East River, saving his army from annihilation. The Continental Army lived to fight another day, and with it, the Revolution survived its first near-death experience. Over the next months, Washington led a desperate fighting retreat across New Jersey. Winter approached, morale plummeted, and enlistments expired. Many believed the revolution was finished, but Washington understood the symbolic power of one decisive stroke. On Christmas night, 1776, he led his men across the icy Delaware River and struck the Hessian garrison at Trenton by surprise. The victory electrified the colonies. A week later, he won again at Princeton. The message was clear. The American cause still lived. As the war expanded, it became not just a rebellion, but a global conflict. Britain fought to preserve its empire, while France, Spain, and the Netherlands watched closely, waiting for signs that the Americans might prevail. The stakes were immense. Could republicanism survive in a world of monarchs? In 1777, British generals devised a plan to cut off New England, the cradle of rebellion, from the rest of the colonies. General John Burgoyne marched south from Canada, expecting to meet another British force from New York, but miscommunication and rugged terrain doomed the effort. At Saratoga, American forces under General Horatio Gates and the daring Benedict Arnold surrounded Burgoyne's army. In October 1777, the British surrendered. a stunning victory that changed everything. The triumph at Saratoga convinced France that the American cause could succeed. In 1778, King Louis XVI recognized the United States and entered the war as its ally. French ships, soldiers, and money transformed the conflict from a colonial rebellion into an international struggle. What began as Britain's problem became a contest that stretched across oceans. Yet even as alliances formed, the war grew harder. The winter of 1777-78 at Valley Forge tested Washington's army beyond measure. Men shivered in rags, without shoes or food. Disease spread through the camp. But amid the suffering came transformation. The arrival of Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer, brought professional discipline and training. He drilled the soldiers relentlessly, teaching them the precision of European warfare. When spring arrived, the Continental Army emerged tougher, united, and ready. Meanwhile, political and social revolutions stirred within the colonies. Congress struggled to govern without funds or authority. Inflation ravaged the economy. Enslaved African Americans, Native nations, and women all faced choices and challenges in this new age of liberty. For many, freedom remained a promise unfulfilled. But the idea of equality, and however imperfectly realized, began to reshape the moral fabric of the continent. In 1778, the war's focus shifted southward. Britain hoped to exploit loyalist support in the Carolinas and Georgia. Savannah and Charleston fell to the British. Brutal fighting erupted in the backcountry. Neighbor against neighbor, loyalist against patriot. Guerrilla leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, waged a campaign of hit-and-run warfare that kept the British off balance. Still, by 1780, the war seemed uncertain. Washington's army remained unpaid and restless. Benedict Arnold, once a hero, turned traitor, selling secrets to the British. Yet even in despair, the revolution endured. Washington's steady leadership, his refusal to seize power, became its moral anchor. He could have been king. Instead, he remained servant of a cause. Then, in 1781, came the final act, Yorktown. British General Charles Cornwallis moved his army into Virginia, establishing a base at the coastal town. Washington seized the moment. With French General Rochambeau and the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse, he marched south in secrecy, leaving New York seemingly undefended. The combined Franco-American army surrounded Yorktown. For weeks, cannons thundered and trenches crept closer to the British lines. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The war was not officially over. Fighting would linger for 2 more years, but Yorktown broke Britain's will to continue. Across the Atlantic, Parliament voted to end the war. Peace negotiations began in Paris, led by Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States, whose boundaries stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. The world had changed. A republic had been born out of rebellion. But the peace that followed brought new questions. How would this fragile union govern itself? Could 13 sovereign states cooperate under a single framework? And what would liberty mean in practice? For farmers, merchants, enslaved people, and future generations. Washington returned home to Mount Vernon, refusing calls to become a monarch. His quiet resignation confirmed the principle that power, once gained, must yield to law. As one observer said, "He has become the greatest man in the world because he was the most virtuous." The revolution had achieved more than victory on the battlefield. It had created a new vision of politics, one in which authority rose from the people, not from a crown. It inspired revolutions in France, Latin America, and beyond. Yet it also left contradictions unresolved. Slavery endured, native nations suffered, and women remained excluded from political rights. The work of liberty was incomplete, but it had begun. By 1787, the weakness of the Articles of Confederation revealed the need for a stronger national framework. Delegates gathered once more in Philadelphia, in the same hall where independence had been declared, to draft a new constitution. They argued, compromised, and crafted a system balancing liberty with order, state with nation, people with government. It was imperfect, but enduring. When Washington took the oath of office as the first president of the United States in 1789, he did so not as a conqueror, but as a citizen. Behind him lay a war of impossible odds. Before him stretched the uncertain future of a republic built on ideas, liberty, equality, and the rule of law. The American Revolution was more than a war for independence. It was a test of human possibility. It asked whether free men and women could govern themselves, and whether a nation born of principle could survive the weight of reality. Its answer was not found in declarations alone, but in the perseverance, sacrifice, and vision of those who believed that freedom, once claimed, must forever be defended. When the guns fell silent at Yorktown, jubilation swept through the American camps. Soldiers wept, embraced, and knelt in prayer. After 6 years of hardship, it seemed the struggle was over, but beneath the cheers lay exhaustion, hunger, and uncertainty. The revolution had won independence, Yet the peace to come would test the new nation in ways no battle ever had. For Washington, victory brought not triumph, but responsibility. His army, unpaid and half-starved, camped along the Hudson River as Congress delayed their wages. Rumors of mutiny spread. Officers, who had sacrificed their fortunes and futures, spoke of marching on Philadelphia to demand their due. Washington rode to address them. Standing before men who had followed him through fire, his voice trembled. Pulling from his pocket a pair of spectacles, he said quietly, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me, for I have grown gray in your service and now find myself growing blind." The room fell silent. His humility disarmed the anger. The mutiny dissolved. In that moment, the army surrendered its claim to power, not to force, but to virtue. Peace came formally with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Britain recognized the independence of the United States and ceded vast western territories. The dream of empire had given way to a republic stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. Yet with this enormous gift came enormous risk. No king, no parliament, no central authority bound the states together, only the fragile Articles of Confederation, a system too weak to govern, too cautious to lead. Washington resigned his commission before Congress, returning to Mount Vernon in what he called the most glorious moment of my life. The world watched in astonishment, a victorious general laying down power. Across Europe, monarchs and philosophers alike marveled. The American experiment appeared truly revolutionary, a government of laws, not of men. But in the young republic, peace was restless. The states quarreled over borders and debts. Paper money flooded the markets. Inflation soared. Farmers who had fought for liberty now faced foreclosure from the same governments they had defended. In western Massachusetts, rebellion flared as Daniel Shays, a veteran of the Continental Army, led armed farmers to close the courts. To many elites, Shays' rebellion seemed proof that liberty without order was chaos. To the farmers, it was a cry that the promises of the revolution, justice, fairness, equality, were being betrayed. Meanwhile, enslaved Africans heard the language of freedom and dared to dream. Some gained liberty by serving in the army. Others were freed by northern legislatures that began gradual emancipation. Yet in the South, slavery expanded. The revolution had exposed the contradiction between the ideals of equality and the practice of bondage, but it would take generations to confront it fully. Native nations, too, faced an uncertain future. They had not been defeated at Yorktown, yet their lands now lay within the claimed boundaries of the United States. Treaties were made and broken. The struggle for America's independence became, for many indigenous peoples, the beginning of dispossession. Across the Atlantic, the revolution reverberated. In Paris, reformers and philosophers hailed the American example as proof that monarchy was not destiny. The language of natural rights and popular sovereignty began to circulate in coffeehouses and salons, planting the seeds of future upheaval. The world had witnessed that ordinary men could found a nation, and that government could rest on consent, not fear. At home, the task of translating victory into stability fell to statesmen rather than soldiers. The Continental Congress, weakened by debt and faction, could not tax or regulate trade. Each state printed its own currency, set its own tariffs, and pursued its own interests. The Confederation was a loose rope fraying under pressure. Even Washington, retired and weary of politics, confessed that something must be done or the fabric must fall. And so, in the summer of 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered once more in Philadelphia. They met in secrecy, the windows of Independence Hall sealed against prying ears. Inside, heat and argument filled the air. Should the nation be ruled by states or by the people? How could liberty survive without order? And order exist without tyranny? James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, and others wrestled with these questions day after day. Compromise became their tool, principle their guide. By September, a new framework emerged. The Constitution of the United States. It created a government of separated powers, balanced among executive, legislative, and judicial branches. It blended federal and state sovereignty, individual liberty with collective security. It was neither pure democracy nor aristocracy, but a daring experiment, a republic, if you can keep it, as Franklin famously warned. The Constitution did not solve every problem. It preserved slavery, excluded women from suffrage, and left Native peoples outside its promises. Yet it established the machinery through which those promises could later be claimed. The Revolution's ideals had found form. Not perfect, but alive. When Washington was unanimously elected, the first president in 1789, he stood once more on the steps of Federal Hall, this time not as a general, but as a citizen. The oath he took bound not only him, but every generation to come. Behind him lay the war, the hardship, the uncertainty. Before him stretched the immense possibility of a nation conceived in liberty. The war for independence had forged more than territory or sovereignty. It had forged identity. America was no longer a collection of colonies, but a people bound by shared ideals, freedom, justice, and self-government. Those ideals would be tested again and again, but in the crucible of revolution, The foundation had been laid. From revolution to republic, the Constitution and the new nation, 1789 to 1800. The revolution had ended, but the true experiment had only begun. In 1789, 13 young states stood together under a new constitution, fragile, untested, and bold in its design. The world looked on, uncertain whether liberty and order could coexist. Could a people rule themselves without falling into chaos? Could a republic endure in a world of kings? At the heart of this new beginning stood George Washington, summoned once again to duty. Against his wishes, he was unanimously chosen as the first president of the United States. When he took the oath of office on April 30th, 1789, standing on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, the crowd below fell silent. His hand trembled as he kissed the Bible. The Revolution's soldier had become the Republic's statesman. The government he inherited was little more than an idea. There were no courts, no treasury, no bureaucracy, only debt, uncertainty, and hope. Yet Washington moved with deliberate steadiness. He surrounded himself with capable minds. Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Henry Knox at War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. Together, they began to shape the machinery of government from the ground up. Hamilton, brilliant and relentless, saw in America the potential for greatness. He believed that national strength required financial stability. In 1790, he unveiled a daring plan. The federal government would assume state debts and establish public credit. He proposed a national bank to regulate currency and encourage investment. His vision was one of industry, commerce, and central authority, a strong federal power to bind the young nation together. Jefferson, by contrast, saw danger in such consolidation. He imagined a republic of farmers and freeholders, independent citizens who would remain virtuous because they were self-sufficient. To him, Hamilton's system reeked of monarchy and corruption. "I fear," Jefferson wrote, "that the government we have founded will become too strong for the liberties of the people." The divide between these two men, between federal power and local freedom, between cities and farms, between ambition and restraint, would define American politics for generations. Washington, ever the mediator, walked carefully between them. He supported Hamilton's financial reforms, but urged moderation and unity. His presidency became a balancing act between ideology and practicality, between revolutionary dreams and political reality. While the founders debated policy, the people tested democracy in daily life. In cities, printers and pamphleteers flooded the streets with political arguments. In the countryside, farmers questioned taxes and authority. The promise of the Revolution lived alongside suspicion of government itself. Then came the first major crisis of federal power, the Whiskey Rebellion. In 1794, Western Pennsylvania farmers, burdened by a federal excise tax on distilled spirits, rose in armed protest. They saw in the tax a symbol of Eastern elitism, a betrayal of the Revolution's egalitarian spirit. Washington, determined to prove that the new government could enforce its laws, personally led 12,000 militia troops toward the rebels. The insurrection collapsed without battle. Washington's message was clear: liberty would not mean anarchy, the rule of law would prevail. Beyond domestic challenges, the young republic faced a dangerous world. Across the Atlantic, the French Revolution erupted in 1789, echoing the American cry for liberty but descending into terror and war. France expected America's support, citing the alliance of 1778. Britain, too, demanded neutrality and respect. The United States, weak, divided, and heavily in debt, found itself caught between empires. Washington, refusing to let the new republic be dragged into European conflict, issued the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793. It was a daring assertion of independence and diplomacy, a declaration that America would stand apart from the rivalries of the Old World. Critics accused him of betraying France. Supporters hailed his prudence. In truth, neutrality was survival, the only path for a nation not yet strong enough to wage foreign wars. Still, tensions with Britain flared. British warships seized American vessels trading with France, and their forts still dotted the western frontier. To avoid war, Washington sent John Jay to negotiate. The resulting Jay Treaty in 1795 secured peace and trade, but outraged many who saw it as too conciliatory. Protesters burned Jay in effigy. Newspapers accused Washington himself of monarchy. For the first time, public opinion turned against the father of the nation. Yet his resolve never wavered. He understood that true leadership meant patience and the courage to endure misunderstanding. By 1796, weary and aging, Washington decided not to seek a third term. His farewell address became his final gift to the nation. In it, he warned against the dangers of factionalism, regional division, and entangling alliances. "The unity of government," he said, "is the main pillar in the edifice of your real independence." Then, quietly, he retired to Mount Vernon. Once more, he relinquished power. And again, the world took note. In an age of tyrants, Washington proved that Republican virtue could be real. His departure opened the first contested presidential election. Two visions of America now stood opposed. The Federalists, led by John Adams and Hamilton, favored strong national authority, close ties with Britain, and commercial development. The Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, championed agrarian democracy, states' rights, and sympathy for France. The election of 1796 ended with John Adams as president and Jefferson as his vice president, rivals forced to share the same executive chamber. Adams inherited a nation at risk. France, angry over the Jay Treaty, began attacking American ships. Diplomacy collapsed in the infamous XYZ affair when French agents demanded bribes from U.S. envoys. Outrage swept the country. "Millions for defense," Americans cried, but not 1 cent for tribute. A quasi-war erupted at sea. Adams strengthened the Navy, launching new frigates like the Constitution and the Constellation. Yet he resisted calls for full war, choosing negotiation over destruction, a decision that cost him politically but preserved the fragile peace. At home, fear of foreign subversion led to overreach. In 1798, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, allowing the government to deport immigrants and punish critics of the administration. Federalists claimed it was for national security. Jeffersonians saw it as tyranny reborn. Newspapers were shuttered, dissenters jailed, and the line between liberty and control blurred once more. Jefferson and Madison struck back in theory, crafting the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which argued that states could nullify unconstitutional federal laws. The debate over the nature of the Union, between state sovereignty and national supremacy, had begun. It would not end until a century later in civil war. By the election of 1800, the young republic faced its greatest internal test. The campaign between Adams and Jefferson was bitter, personal, and venomous. Newspapers accused Jefferson of atheism and Adams of monarchy. The very future of the revolution seemed at stake. Yet, amid the fury, the nation did something extraordinary. It chose peacefully. When Jefferson won, Adams quietly stepped aside. No troops marched, no blood was spilled. Power changed hands not by force, but by ballots. The world took notice. The American experiment, government by the consent of the governed, had survived its first storm. In his inaugural address, Jefferson struck a conciliatory tone. "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." The revolution, he declared, was not complete. It was ongoing, renewed with each generation. The Constitution had endured its first trial, proving that the Republic could bend without breaking. By 1800, the United States was still a small nation, fragile, imperfect, and divided. Yet within its borders lived a new kind of hope. The founders' debates, Washington's restraint, Adams' resolve, and Jefferson's ideals had together created something unprecedented, a government of laws, sustained not by kings or armies, but by the trust and participation of its people. The revolution had begun with gunfire at Lexington and Concord. It ended, for now, in the quiet transfer of power between two political rivals. The world had never seen such a thing. The Republic, against every prediction, still stood. The expanding Republic, Jefferson, Madison, and the new American vision, 1800-1820. The Revolution had proven that freedom could be won. The Constitution had shown that liberty could be governed. Now, at the dawn of a new century, America faced a deeper question. How far could freedom reach? Would the Republic remain a coastal experiment, or would it become something far greater, a continental nation with destiny stretching toward the western horizon? The year 1800 marked a peaceful revolution, not of muskets, but of ideas. Thomas Jefferson, philosopher of the Revolution, became the nation's third president. His election symbolized a turning point. Power had passed peacefully from one party to another, from Federalist conservatism to Republican democracy. Jefferson's inauguration, held in the rough frontier capital of Washington, D.C., was deliberately simple. Walked to the ceremony, dressed plainly, refusing pomp. In his inaugural address, he reminded the nation, "The sum of good government is a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, and shall leave them otherwise free to pursue their own industry and improvement." He envisioned an America of small farmers, enlightened citizens, and limited government, a republic of reason and virtue rather than privilege and power. Yet the world, as always, refused simplicity. The Louisiana Purchase, an empire for liberty. In 1803, opportunity knocked, and Jefferson answered with boldness that startled even himself. Across the Atlantic, Napoleon Bonaparte, embroiled in European wars, offered to sell the vast Louisiana territory to the United States. For $15 million, mere cents per acre, America could double its size overnight. Jefferson hesitated. The Constitution, which he revered, did not explicitly grant the president power to acquire new lands, but the chance was too great to ignore. It is the case of a guardian, he reasoned, buying a great estate for his ward before the ward has come of age. The Louisiana Purchase became a defining act, transforming the nation from a string of Atlantic states into a continental power. It extended the Republic's reach from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, planting the idea of manifest destiny long before the phrase existed. To explore this immense new domain, Jefferson commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to lead an expedition across the continent. Their corps of discovery, accompanied by the young Shoshone woman Sacagawea, set out in 1804. For more than 2 years, they charted rivers, cataloged flora and fauna, and met indigenous nations whose worlds were suddenly entwined with a growing republic. When they returned in 1806, they had opened a new chapter of the American imagination, the dream of the West, vast, untamed, and full of promise. But expansion came with contradictions. As settlers poured westward, the question of slavery followed them. Would the new territories permit human bondage, or would they be free? The issue lingered, unresolved, like a thundercloud on the horizon. Conflict and neutrality. The struggle for sovereignty. Beyond America's borders, Europe's wars once again threatened to pull the young republic into turmoil. Britain and France, locked in bitter conflict, preyed upon American trade. British warships seized U.S. sailors, forcing them into service in the Royal Navy, an insult that stoked public outrage. Jefferson, committed to peace, sought to avoid war through economic means. In 1807, he imposed the Embargo Act, cutting off all American exports in protest of foreign interference. It was a bold but disastrous move. The embargo strangled the very economy it was meant to protect. Merchants in New England saw ships rot in harbor, farmers' crops spoiled unsold, and unemployment spread. Jefferson's dream of peaceful coercion failed. Instead of humbling Europe, it punished Americans. As his presidency ended in 1809, Jefferson retired to Monticello, still revered, but chastened by the limits of idealism in a world of power. The burden of the presidency now fell to James Madison, Jefferson's close ally and the Constitution's principal architect. Madison, thoughtful and mild in manner, inherited the same storm: British aggression, native resistance in the West, and mounting calls for national honor. The War of 1812, the Second American Revolution. By 1812, patience had run out. Congress declared war on Great Britain, a decision that split the nation. Federalists denounced it as reckless. Republicans hailed it as a defense of sovereignty. The war began poorly. The U.S. Army was small, its leadership uneven, and the nation's finances weak. British forces captured Detroit, blockaded ports, and supported native confederations, resisting American expansion. Yet amid the setbacks rose new symbols of courage. On the seas, the U.S. Navy astonished the world. The frigate USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, defeated British warships in single combat, proving that the American flag could hold its own on the high seas. On land, General William Henry Harrison triumphed at Tippecanoe against forces led by the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, whose vision of a united native resistance fell with his death in battle. Then came 1814, the Republic's darkest year. British troops marched into Washington, D.C., burning the Capitol and the White House. President Madison and his wife Dolly Madison fled the city, she carrying with her the now iconic portrait of George Washington. Smoke rose above the Capitol, a vision of vulnerability and endurance. Yet even as the Capitol burned, resilience flared elsewhere. At Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor, American defenders repelled a furious British bombardment. Watching from a ship, Francis Scott Key saw the flag still waving at dawn and wrote the words that would become the Star-Spangled Banner. The war's final act unfolded far to the south. In January 1815, unaware that peace had already been negotiated, General Andrew Jackson led a ragtag army of frontiersmen, free black volunteers, and militia to victory at the Battle of New Orleans. The triumph electrified the nation, a stunning display of unity and courage. Though the Treaty of Ghent ended the war without territorial change, Americans celebrated as if they had won a second independence. The United States had stood against the might of Britain and survived. The era of good feelings. When Madison left office in 1817, he was succeeded by James Monroe, another Virginian and Revolutionary veteran. His presidency ushered in what newspapers called the era of good feelings. Political unity seemed at hand. The Federalist Party faded and national pride swelled. Canals, roads, and the first stirrings of industry promised prosperity. The wounds of war appeared to heal. Yet beneath the surface, new tensions brewed. Expansion westward revived the old question: would slavery expand too? In 1820, the debate reached crisis with the Missouri Compromise. Congress admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free one, preserving balance in the Senate, but it also drew a line, latitude 36 to 30, beyond which slavery would be banned in future territories. It was a temporary truce, a political bandage over a moral wound that continued to fester. Monroe's time also saw the birth of a new declaration, one that defined America's place in the world. In 1823, the Monroe Doctrine warned European powers against interfering in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. The American continents, Monroe proclaimed, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization. The statement carried little military weight, but immense symbolic power. The New World had declared its independence not just in politics, but in principle. The new American vision. By 1820, the United States was unrecognizable from the fragile republic of 1789. Its territory stretched to the Rockies. Its population had tripled, and its sense of destiny had grown with each generation. Yet the contradictions at its core, liberty and slavery, unity and division, expansion and displacement, had grown as well. Jefferson, in his final years, watched the changes with both pride and anxiety. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," he had written, but he now saw how unevenly they were kept. "I tremble for my country," he confessed, "when I reflect that God is just." Still, the American experiment endured. Guided by an idea that was larger than its flaws, the founders had sought to build a nation where freedom was not the privilege of the few, but the promise of the many. By 1820, that promise glimmered on every frontier, echoed in every schoolhouse and statehouse, and beckoned settlers westward toward horizons still unclaimed. The Republic was expanding, not just in size, but in imagination. A new generation was rising, born not under the crown, but under the flag. They would inherit both the blessings and the burdens of the founders' creation. And, as the 19th century unfolded, they would test again whether this union, vast, diverse, and restless, could remain one nation, indivisible and free. The age of Jackson, democracy, division, and the rise of the common man, 1820, 1840. The generation that followed Jefferson and Madison inherited a young nation full of promise and contradiction. The Revolution had secured independence. The Constitution had defined government. The frontier had stretched the imagination. But as the 1820s dawned, a new energy began to surge, one that would shake the political order to its core. It was the rise of the common man, the farmer, the frontiersman, the self-made citizen, and no figure embodied that new spirit more completely than Andrew Jackson, the people's champion. Born in the Carolina backcountry in 1767, Andrew Jackson rose from humble origins. He was a boy soldier in the Revolution, captured by the British, scarred by a sword, and orphaned by war. He became a lawyer on the Tennessee frontier, a duelist, a general, and finally a national hero. His victory at New Orleans in 1815 had made him a living legend, the man who had humbled Britain's finest troops with grit, instinct, and audacity. To his admirers, Jackson was a symbol of the Republic's democratic promise, proof that greatness need not come from privilege. To his critics, he was dangerous, proud, temperamental, and given to passion over principle. Either way, America had never seen a leader quite like him. The election of 1824 became the stage for his dramatic entrance. 4 candidates, Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and William Crawford, divided the vote. Jackson won the popular vote and the most electoral votes, but lacked a majority. The decision went to the House of Representatives, where Henry Clay threw his support to Adams. When Adams became president and soon appointed Clay as Secretary of State, Jackson's supporters cried foul, a corrupt bargain. The charge of corruption struck deep. For 4 years, Jackson's followers rallied under the banner of Democracy Betrayed, organizing what would become the Democratic Party. In 1828, they brought their champion to victory in one of the fiercest and most emotional campaigns in American history. Adams represented the old order, polished, learned, aristocratic. Jackson stood for the new, raw, forceful, unrefined, yet undeniably popular. When the votes were counted, Jackson won by a landslide. The age of Jackson had begun, a new kind of politics. Jackson's inauguration on March 4th, 1829, was unlike any in memory. Thousands of ordinary Americans, farmers, mechanics, and frontiersmen, flooded Washington, cheering, weeping, and crowding the Capitol steps. After his swearing in, the crowd surged into the White House itself, breaking glasses, trampling carpets, and celebrating wildly until the new president slipped away to safety. To some observers, it was democracy run amok. To others, it was democracy at last made visible. Jackson's presidency marked a profound shift in American politics. Property qualifications for voting had been eliminated in most states, and political participation soared. Newspapers multiplied, party conventions replaced elite caucuses, and campaigning became a national spectacle. The people, not just the gentry, now claimed ownership of the Republic. Jackson styled himself as the tribune of the people. "The majority is to govern," he declared, "and their will, faithfully executed, is the law of the land." He believed that government should be simple, direct, and responsive, and that public officials who betrayed the people's trust should be removed. Thus began the spoils system, in which Jackson replaced hundreds of federal employees with loyal supporters. Critics called it patronage. Jackson called it democracy in action. The battle for the bank. Jackson's most defining struggle came not against foreign enemies, but against domestic institution, the Second Bank of the United States. Chartered in 1816, the bank served as a central financial power, stabilizing currency and credit. But Jackson saw it as a monster, an engine of privilege controlled by wealthy elites in Philadelphia and New York. To him, it stood as a betrayal of the people's liberty. When Congress moved to renew the bank's charter in 1832, Jackson struck back with his famous veto message. In it, he framed the issue not as one of finance, but of justice. The rich and powerful too often bend the axe of government to their selfish purposes. His veto electrified the nation. Supporters hailed it as a triumph for democracy. Opponents called it demagoguery. The election that year became a referendum on the bank, and Jackson won overwhelmingly. Emboldened, he ordered federal deposits withdrawn from the bank and placed in smaller state pet banks. The economy surged at first, fueled by speculation and easy credit. But when the bubble burst, the Panic of 1837 plunged the nation into depression, a reminder that democracy too could stumble in the realm of economics. The Indian removal. Not all of Jackson's actions wore the mantle of liberty. His most tragic legacy lay in his Indian policy. Determined to open southern lands to white settlement, Jackson pushed through the Indian Removal Act of 1830, authorizing the forced relocation of Native American nations east of the Mississippi. Despite resistance and even a Supreme Court decision, Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, affirming native sovereignty, Jackson pressed forward. "John Marshall has made his decision," he reportedly said. "Now let him enforce it." The result was one of the darkest chapters in American history, the Trail of Tears. Under military coercion, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole peoples were driven from their ancestral lands, forced to march hundreds of miles to new territory in the West. Thousands died from disease, exposure, and hunger. It was, for many, a betrayal of the very ideals the Republic claimed to uphold: nullification and the Union. As the nation expanded, another tension simmered: the balance between state and federal authority. In 1832, South Carolina declared that federal tariffs were unconstitutional and refused to enforce them, a doctrine called nullification, advanced by Jackson's former vice president, John C. Calhoun. Jackson, though a Southerner and a states' rights advocate, saw nullification as treason. "Disunion by armed force," he thundered, "is treason. Are you ready to incur its guilt?" He sent troops to enforce federal law and sought congressional authority to act, even as he worked privately toward compromise. The nullification crisis ended peacefully when Congress passed a reduced tariff, but Jackson had made his point. The Union, he vowed, must and shall be preserved. The rise of the Whigs and the changing Republic. Jackson's boldness? His enemies said tyranny, but gave rise to a new political opposition, the Whig Party. Led by Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, the Whigs championed a strong Congress, economic modernization, and moral reform. They portrayed Jackson as King Andrew I, ruling by personal will rather than constitutional restraint. The two-party system was reborn, shaping American politics for decades to come. Jackson's chosen successor, Martin Van Buren, inherited both his mentor's popularity and his problems. The Panic of 1837 struck soon after Van Buren's inauguration, plunging the country into economic chaos. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, and unemployment soared. Van Buren's cautious policies deepened public frustration, and by 1840, the Whigs seized their opportunity. They nominated William Henry Harrison, hero of Tippecanoe, portraying him as a humble frontiersman, though he was, in truth, a Virginia aristocrat. The Whigs' campaign, filled with songs, parades, and slogans, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, marked a new era of mass politics. Harrison won easily, but died just weeks into his term, leaving Vice President John Tyler to face a divided nation. The Jacksonian legacy. By 1840, America had transformed beyond recognition. The political world of Washington and Adams, once the preserve of educated elites, had given way to a raucous, participatory democracy. Voter turnout had soared, public opinion ruled. Ordinary citizens now believed their voices mattered, and that government, however imperfect, belonged to them. Yet the Jacksonian age also left deep contradictions. Democracy expanded for white men, even as native peoples were displaced and enslaved Africans remained in bondage. The language of liberty grew louder, but so did the silence around those excluded from it. The promise of equality still stopped at color, gender, and class lines that would haunt the Republic for generations. Still, the spirit of the age could not be denied. The people had entered the stage of history, loud, proud, and determined. They had claimed their government, their vote, and their future. In that turbulent, flawed, and exhilarating moment, America became, for better or worse, a democracy of the masses. The nation stood poised between triumph and trial, a republic more dynamic, more divided, and more alive than ever before. And soon, new voices, abolitionists, reformers, and dreamers, would rise to challenge its conscience once again. The fires of reform and the coming storm. America between slavery and freedom, 1840, 1860. By the 1840s, the United States had become a nation of contrasts. On one hand, the frontier stretched ever westward. Cities thrived, and commerce bound distant regions together. On the other, the shadow of slavery loomed large. Sectional tensions deepened, and moral questions once whispered in private were now shouted in public squares. The Republic's promise of liberty was coming under trial, not from foreign powers, but from its own contradictions. The age of reform. This was an era of intense social experimentation. Americans of every background began to imagine that society itself could be remade. Abolitionists rose, challenging slavery as a sin against both God and justice. Leaders such as William Lloyd Garrison published The Liberator, declaring that slavery must end immediately without compromise. Frederick Douglass, a former slave whose eloquence and courage had electrified audiences, spoke of liberty as more than a political idea. It was a human right, inherent and non-negotiable. Women, too, began to claim their voices. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, demanded equality, suffrage, and recognition of women as full citizens. Their Declaration of Sentiments, modeled on the Declaration of Independence, argued that men and women were created equal. It was radical, controversial, and prophetic, planting seeds for struggles that would continue for decades. At the same time, reformers addressed temperance, education, and care for the poor and mentally ill. Horace Mann championed public education as essential to democracy. Dorothea Dix fought to create humane institutions for the mentally ill. Evangelical revivals, the Second Great Awakening, spread across the nation, inspiring moral fervor and activism. Americans came to believe that freedom was not only political, but also social and spiritual, that liberty demanded responsibility, the westward push and manifest destiny. While reformers debated morality, the nation moved westward with relentless energy. The ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were divinely ordained to expand across the continent, swept the country. Settlers streamed into territories beyond the Mississippi, displacing native nations and creating new states. The annexation of Texas in 1845 and the war with Mexico, 1846, 1848, were watershed moments. Victory brought immense territorial gains, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, but also fierce debate. Would slavery extend into these new lands? The balance between free and slave states, once tenuous, was threatened anew. Slavery and sectional conflict. By mid-century, slavery had become the defining moral, economic, and political issue in the United States. The invention of the cotton gin had cemented the South's reliance on enslaved labor. Cotton fields stretched from South Carolina to Mississippi and Louisiana, and the global demand for king cotton enriched Southern elites. Yet enslaved people suffered brutality, bondage, and deprivation, while northern states increasingly industrialized and rejected slavery. Abolitionists demanded immediate action, but southern leaders insisted on protecting what they called their peculiar institution. Tensions exploded in Congress, in newspapers, and even on the streets. The Compromise of 1850 attempted to quell unrest by admitting California as a free state while allowing new territories to decide the slavery question for themselves, the principle of popular sovereignty. It also included the Fugitive Slave Act, forcing northern states to return escaped slaves, inflaming passions and inspiring civil disobedience. Meanwhile, literature became a weapon in the fight over slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, dramatized the cruelty of slavery, stirring the conscience of the North and terrifying the South. The book revealed, in ways statistics never could, the human cost of bondage. Families torn apart, lives destroyed, and a moral system built on violence and oppression. Political upheaval and the sectional divide. The growing sectional divide reshaped politics. The Whig Party collapsed under the weight of internal conflict over slavery. The Democratic Party splintered along regional lines. In the North, anti-slavery sentiment fueled the rise of the Republican Party, which sought to prevent the expansion of slavery into Western territories. In the South, leaders became increasingly defensive and militant, framing slavery as essential to their economy, culture, and social order. Violence sometimes foreshadowed civil war. In Kansas, settlers fought over whether the territory would allow slavery, an episode known as Bleeding Kansas. Canals, railroads, and migration brought competing populations into contact, and disputes turned deadly. The nation's institutions, Congress, the courts, even the presidency, struggled to mediate between moral principle and political necessity. The moral question intensifies. During these decades, Americans were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. The Revolution had promised liberty for all, yet millions remained enslaved. Native peoples had been pushed from their homelands, their nations decimated. Women remained politically powerless. Reformers and radicals understood that freedom could not be half-measured. Liberty, they argued, demanded action, not compromise. The nation's expansion brought wealth, opportunity, and power, but also moral peril. Every new territory reopened the question of slavery. Every political compromise postponed the inevitable reckoning. The Union, once held together by common revolutionary ideals, now strained under the weight of conflicting interests, regional loyalties, and competing visions of freedom. Toward the storm. By 1860, the United States stood on the edge of a profound crisis. The fires of reform, abolitionism, women's rights, education, temperance, burned alongside the combustible passions of expansion and slavery. The political system, though robust, could no longer contain the nation's conflicts. Sectionalism, economic disparity, and moral disagreement had become inseparable. The promise of liberty that had animated the revolution, guided the Constitution, and energized Jacksonian democracy now faced its most urgent test. Could a nation built on freedom endure when half of its population was denied it? Could compromise hold when moral conviction and political power collided? The storm was coming. By 1860, the country had been forged by war, expansion, and reform. But the next great struggle, one that would decide whether the Union could survive and whether liberty could truly be universal, was just on the horizon. The stage was set for the most violent, tragic, and transformative conflict in American history, the Civil War. The battles of ideology, morality, and power that had simmered for decades were about to erupt. The nation's experiment in liberty, democracy, and unity would be tested as never before. The Civil War, secession, struggle, and the battle for the Union, 1860 to 1865. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 shattered the fragile equilibrium that had held the United States together for decades. Lincoln, a moderate Republican, had promised to prevent the expansion of slavery into new territories, no more, no less. But for Southern leaders, that was enough to trigger alarm. They saw in his victory the end of their economic system, their social order, and their vision of a society built on slavery. Within weeks, South Carolina seceded from the Union, followed rapidly by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. The Confederate States of America had been born, electing Jefferson Davis as president. Lincoln, resolute and measured, declared that secession was illegal. The Union was perpetual, indivisible, and worth fighting to preserve. The stage was set for war, the outbreak of war. The first shots fell at Fort Sumter in April 1861. Confederate forces fired on the federal fort in Charleston Harbor, forcing its surrender. The sound of cannon fire echoed across the South and North alike, signaling that the nation's deepest conflict had begun. Volunteers rushed to both armies, answering the call with idealism, patriotism, and, for some, fear. Washington braced for crisis. The Union Army was small, poorly trained, and scattered. The Confederacy, despite its smaller population and industrial base, relied on defensive strategy and a sense of home ground advantage. The early months of the war exposed the country's unpreparedness, but also the determination of both sides to fight for what they believed was right. Key battles and turning points. The war quickly escalated into a struggle of staggering scale. First Bull Run in July 1861 shocked the nation. Spectators watched, thinking it would be a short engagement, only to see Union forces routed by Confederate troops. The war was not a fleeting rebellion. It was a long, brutal, and unforgiving conflict. By 1862, major battles tested strategy, endurance, and leadership. Shiloh in Tennessee, Antietam in Maryland, and Fredericksburg in Virginia revealed staggering casualties in the grim reality of modern warfare. Rifled muskets, ironclad ships, and entrenched positions made each engagement devastating. Letters from soldiers, written in cramped camps or on bloodied fields, spoke of courage, fear, and longing for home. The human toll of the conflict was immeasurable. The war was also a contest of leadership. Ulysses S. Grant emerged as a determined, unflinching commander, willing to press advantage and absorb casualties to achieve strategic goals. Robert E. Lee, leading the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, combined tactical brilliance with audacity, inspiring men to follow him through hopeless odds. Each encounter was a crucible, shaping the destiny of the nation, the war and emancipation. From the outset, slavery was intertwined with the conflict. For Lincoln, the primary aim was preservation of the Union, but he also recognized that the moral question of slavery could not be ignored. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1, 1863, declared freedom for all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory. Though limited in immediate practical effect, it transformed the war. It made the fight not only about Union, but also about human liberty, drawing abolitionists and African Americans into the struggle. Thousands of formerly enslaved men joined the Union Army, bringing courage and manpower to the cause. Their service redefined the meaning of citizenship and patriotism, challenging assumptions about race, equality, and freedom. The war was no longer just a struggle over territory, it was a struggle over the very soul of the nation. Turning points and attrition. By 1863, momentum shifted. Gettysburg in July became the war's bloodiest battle, a 3-day inferno in which Union forces repelled Lee's invasion of the North. The same summer saw the fall of Vicksburg, giving the Union control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. President Lincoln, visiting battlefields and writing letters, understood the heavy price of victory. "I hope to God we shall all come out safe," he wrote, knowing that the nation could survive only if courage and compromise endured alongside strategy. War raged in every theater: the western frontier, the rivers and railroads, the cities and countryside. Civilians endured sieges, shortages, and the destruction of farms and towns. Disease claimed more lives than bullets. Families were divided by loyalty, some fighting for the Union, others for the Confederacy. Communities once bound together now faced betrayal, suspicion, and grief. The final year. By 1864, the Union adopted a strategy of total war. Sherman's march to the sea in Georgia sought to break the Confederacy's capacity to fight by destroying infrastructure, supplies, and morale. Atlanta burned, plantations were seized, and railroads torn apart. The tactic was ruthless, but it hastened the collapse of Confederate resistance. Meanwhile, Lincoln's re-election in 1864 was far from guaranteed. War weariness and political opposition threatened his leadership. Yet his victory confirmed that the Northern electorate still endorsed his vision of preservation and, increasingly, emancipation. In the spring of 1865, the Confederacy crumbled. Richmond, the Confederate capital, fell. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. The guns finally fell silent. Victory, however, came amid grief. Lincoln would not see Reconstruction. He was assassinated less than a week later, leaving the nation to mourn the man who had guided it through its darkest hour. The human and national cost. By the war's end, more than 600,000 men lay dead, and millions more were wounded, displaced, or traumatized. Slavery had been abolished by the 13th Amendment, but the struggle for equality had only begun. Southern society lay in ruins. Northern cities, though victorious, bore scars of grief and disruption. The Union was preserved, but the price was immeasurable. The Civil War had fundamentally reshaped the nation. It settled the question of secession, ended legalized slavery, and established the principle that the United States was indivisible. Yet it left deep wounds: regional animosity, racial inequality, and political division that would take generations to heal. A nation transformed. When the last Confederate flags were lowered and the Union colors remained, the United States emerged as something new, a republic tempered by catastrophe, bound together by sacrifice, and defined by its ideals even in the face of suffering. The revolution had birthed the nation. Jacksonian democracy had expanded participation. And now, after 4 years of bloodshed, the Civil War had finally tested whether liberty and unity could coexist. The fires of conflict had purified, scarred, and strengthened the nation simultaneously. The United States was no longer just a collection of states. It was a people united, imperfectly, painfully, but indelibly, by the principles of freedom, equality, and shared destiny. The story of the Republic was far from over, but the Civil War had answered, in its devastating way, the question that had haunted the nation since 1776. Could liberty endure when confronted by its own contradictions? Reconstruction and the Long Road to Justice, 1865-1877. The guns of the Civil War had fallen silent, but the war's deepest questions remained unresolved. Slavery had been abolished, the Union preserved, yet the nation faced an unprecedented challenge: how to rebuild the South, integrate millions of newly freed people, and reconcile a country divided by 4 years of unimaginable violence. This was the era of Reconstruction, a period of hope, struggle, and profound uncertainty. Lincoln's vision and the promise of amnesty. Abraham Lincoln had envisioned a swift and merciful restoration of the Southern states. His plan, the 10% Plan, offered amnesty to white Southerners willing to take an oath of loyalty and accept the end of slavery. Lincoln understood the need for healing, for the country to move forward without vengeance. Yet his assassination in April 1865 shattered that vision. Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat loyal to the Union, assumed the presidency. Johnson shared Lincoln's desire to restore white political control, but he lacked the moral authority, political skill, and vision to protect the rights of newly freed African Americans. Freedmen, the Freedmen's Bureau, and the struggle for rights. At the heart of Reconstruction were the freed people themselves, men and women emerging from bondage into a world of uncertain freedom. They sought land, education, and legal protection. They demanded the ability to live with dignity, work for fair wages, and vote without intimidation. The federal government responded in part through the Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865 to provide food, housing, medical care, schools, and legal aid to former slaves. Northern missionaries and reformers built schools and taught literacy, igniting a revolution of knowledge. For the first time, millions of African Americans could read, write, and participate in civic life. But the promise of freedom collided with entrenched prejudice. White Southern elites, determined to maintain social hierarchy, resisted with violence, intimidation, and discriminatory laws. Black codes were enacted to restrict movement, labor, and civil rights, effectively attempting to recreate slavery under a new guise. Radical Reconstruction and the constitutional amendments. Faced with Johnson's leniency, radical Republicans in Congress took charge. They sought to guarantee civil and political rights for freed people and reshape Southern society. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 granted citizenship and equal protection under the law, while the 14th Amendment enshrined these rights constitutionally. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 divided the South into military districts, requiring new state constitutions, voter registration for African American men, and ratification of the 14th Amendment before rejoining the Union. For the first time, African Americans could vote, run for office, and participate in governance. During this period, remarkable leaders emerged. Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce represented Mississippi in the U.S. Senate. Robert Smalls, a former slave who had commandeered a Confederate ship to freedom, became a legislator. State legislatures passed progressive reforms, public schools, infrastructure, and protections for workers. It was a fleeting glimpse of what freedom could achieve when backed by power and law. Backlash and the rise of white supremacy. But the promise of Reconstruction faced relentless opposition. The Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1866, used terror to suppress African American political participation and intimidate allies. White vigilantes murdered, whipped, and threatened those who dared to exercise new rights. Sharecropping and tenant farming replaced slavery economically, binding freed people to landowners through cycles of debt and dependence. Despite federal efforts, Southern whites gradually regained political control. President Johnson's impeachment in 1868 failed to remove him, revealing limits in enforcing Reconstruction policies. Grant's presidency, 1869-1877, initially brought hope, with federal troops defending African American voters and prosecuting Klan violence. But scandals, economic downturns, and waning Northern commitment undermined progress. The end of Reconstruction. By 1877, the era of federal intervention ended. The Compromise of 1877, resolving the disputed presidential election, withdrew remaining Union troops from the South. Southern Democrats regained control, and Reconstruction's gains were rolled back. African Americans were forced into a system of segregation, disenfranchisement, and violence that would endure for nearly a century. Yet the legacy of Reconstruction was profound. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments remained, defining the legal framework for citizenship, equality, and voting rights. Freed people had experienced self-government and political participation, planting seeds that would inspire the civil rights movements of the 20th century. Reconstruction had been imperfect, contested, and incomplete, but it represented the first radical attempt to realize the Revolution's promise for all Americans. A nation transformed, yet divided. Reconstruction exposed the deepest tensions of the American experiment. Freedom and equality were ideals enshrined in law, yet the reality of social power, prejudice, and economic dependency constrained them. The Union had been preserved, slavery abolished, but the moral and political work of justice was far from finished. The period revealed both the possibilities of federal power to enforce rights and the fragility of those rights when popular will faltered. It was a nation at a crossroads, capable of expansion, reform, and innovation, yet vulnerable to division, inequality, and reactionary forces. The long road ahead. As Reconstruction ended in 1877, African Americans faced a new era of oppression under Jim Crow laws, but the ideals of the amendments and the struggle for freedom endured. The United States had survived civil war and assassination, defeat and terror, triumph and betrayal. It had been tested to its limits, yet it endured. The long road to justice stretched ahead, a journey that would define generations, demanding courage, advocacy, and moral clarity. The experiments of Reconstruction, though incomplete, offered a blueprint. That liberty, equality, and the rule of law were ideals worth defending, even when the path was perilous and the victories partial. By the close of this era, the United States remained a union of promise and contradiction, a nation transformed by war and reform, yet still struggling to define what freedom truly meant for all its people.